The wailing pierced the still morning air like a knife, echoing through the family compound. Agatha, the eldest daughter, had been the first to scream when she entered the room meant to house their late father's body. Others rushed to the small parlor, only to be met with the horrifying sight of an empty mat, the white burial shroud discarded carelessly on the ground. "The body is gone," Agatha cried, her voice trembling with disbelief. "What do you mean gone?" Aunt Elizabeth, their father's younger sister, demanded as she pushed past the growing crowd. Her eyes darted to the empty mat, and her hands flew to her head in a dramatic gesture of grief. God forbid! Who could do such a thing? The room erupted into chaos. Mourners who had traveled far and wide to pay their respects joined in the commotion. Some shouted in anger, others wept openly, and a few muttered prayers under their breath, clutching rosaries or prayer beads. Who could have done this? Their younger brother, Kenneth, bellowed, pacing the room like a trapped lion. He clenched his fists, his face a mask of fury and confusion. What kind of heartless person would steal a dead body? The air was heavy with suspicion and grief. Everyone present began speculating, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of accusations. "It must be someone close to the family," a cousin suggested, her eyes narrowing suspiciously at the gathering. "Maybe it's a ritualist," someone whispered, the words sending a shiver through the crowd. "Don't speak nonsense," Aunt Elizabeth snapped, her voice sharp. "No ritualist would dare come here. This is family business." Agatha sank to the floor, her hands covering her face as sobs racked her body. Their father, Mr. Samuel Okoro, had been a man of integrity, respected and loved by all. His sudden death had been hard enough to bear, but this? The desecration of his remains was a blow none of them had prepared for. "Where is Chaik?" Aunt Elizabeth suddenly asked, her voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent. "Chaik? What has he got to do with this?" Agatha asked, lifting her tear-streaked face. "I'm just asking," Elizabeth said defensively. "He wasn't here when we woke up this morning." Kenneth frowned. "That's true. I haven't seen him either." The mention of Chik's name ignited a fresh wave of murmurs. Chaik, the youngest son, had always been different. While his siblings followed their father's disciplined footsteps, Chaik had chosen a more rebellious path, one marked by constant clashes with his family. "You don't think he could have?" Agatha's voice trailed off as the thought took root. Kenneth's jaw tightened. "Where is he? Someone call him." One of the cousins ran to Chika's room, only to return moments later, shaking his head. "He's not there. His bed hasn't been slept in." A heavy silence hung over the room, broken only by the sound of Agatha's muffled sobs. "This is madness," Aunt Elizabeth said, pacing the room. "If Chaik took the body, he must have a reason. But what could it be?" The question swirled, unanswered and haunting. Why would anyone, let alone Chaik, steal their father's body? What could he possibly gain? As the family gathered in tense clusters, speculating and theorizing, one thing became clear: Chaik had to be found. Kenneth grabbed his car keys. "I'll go look for him. He couldn't have gone far. And if he did this," Aunt Elizabeth said, her voice low and ominous, "he will have to answer to all of us." The family members exchanged worried glances as Kenneth stormed out of the compound. Outside, the morning sun shone brightly, oblivious to the darkness that now hung over the Okoro family. Somewhere, Chaik was out there, and with him, the lifeless body of their beloved father. The question was why, and whether the family was ready for the answers they might uncover. Kenneth had barely returned from a fruitless search for Chaik when Agatha's phone buzzed on the table. The sound startled the room, already thick with tension and unease. Everyone turned to look at the phone as though it held the answer to their misery. Agatha picked it up, her fingers trembling. Her heart raced as she opened the message. The words stared back at her like a slap to the face. "My share of wealth for his body." Her gasp was loud enough to draw everyone's attention. She covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "What is it?" Aunt Elizabeth demanded, rushing to her side. Agatha handed the phone to her without speaking. Aunt Elizabeth squinted at the screen, and her face contorted in disbelief. "What kind of wickedness is this?" she exclaimed, holding the phone up for the others to see. Kenneth snatched it from her, reading the message aloud. "My share of wealth for his body." His voice cracked, the weight of the words pressing down on everyone in the room. "What does that even mean?" Agatha whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's Chaik," Aunt Elizabeth said, her tone sharp. "Who else would send such a message?" "Wait," Kenneth interjected, his brows furrowed. "We don't know for sure. Did the message come from his number?" Agatha nodded. "It's his number." Kenneth's face darkened, and he began pacing the room. "This is insane. Is he holding our father's body for ransom? For money? Money?" Agatha repeated, her voice rising. "What kind of person does that? His own father?" Aunt Elizabeth shook her head, her hands trembling. "This is what happens when you indulge a child too much." Samuel was too lenient with that boy, always making excuses for him. Stop blaming Papa, Agatha shot back. This isn't about him. This is Chica's doing, and we need to figure out why. Kenneth slammed his fist on the table, silencing the room. Enough. Fighting won't solve anything. We need to talk to Chike. Right now. But how? Aunt Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling. He's not answering calls. He's not here. How do we even begin to find him? Kenneth's phone rang, cutting through the heavy silence. He fumbled to answer it, his hands unsteady. Hello? Your brother, a voice said on the other end, was seen at the old family house in the village early this morning. Kenneth's heart sank. The old family house had been abandoned for years, a place filled with memories of their father's struggles and triumphs. If Chike had taken their father's body there, it could only mean one thing: he wanted to make a point. Kenneth hung up and turned to the others. He's at the old family house. Agatha's hand flew to her chest. What is he doing there? I don't know, Kenneth replied. But I'm going to find out. No, Aunt Elizabeth said firmly. We're all going. This isn't something one person can handle alone. The ride to the old family house was tense, the silence broken only by the occasional sniffle from Agatha. When they arrived, the sight of Chica's car parked outside confirmed their fears. Kenneth led the way into the house, his heart pounding. They found Chike in the sitting room, sitting beside a wooden table. A white cloth covered something on the floor, a shrouded figure that could only be their father's body. Chike looked up as they entered, his face a mix of defiance and desperation. What is this madness, Chike? Kenneth demanded, his voice shaking with anger. Madness? Chike repeated, his tone bitter. You think I'm mad? You stole our father's body. Agatha cried, tears streaming down her face. How could you do this to us? Chike stood, his hands balled into fists. Us? He spat. Don't talk to me about family, Agatha. You all only remember I exist when it suits you. That's not true, Aunt Elizabeth said, stepping forward. We've always been there for you, Chike. Your father. Don't. Chike cut her off, his voice breaking. Don't talk to me about him. He spent his whole life building wealth, and for what? To leave it all to the rest of you while I get nothing? What are you talking about? Kenneth asked, confused. Chike laughed bitterly. He made it clear, didn't he? The business goes to Kenneth. The house to Agatha. And me? Nothing. Like him, not even his son. That's not true, Agatha said, her voice choked with emotion. Papa loved you. He just wanted you to. To what? Be like you? Chike snapped. Perfect Agatha, the golden child. Kenneth, the heir. And me? The failure. Always the failure. Tears streamed down his face as he gestured to the shrouded figure on the floor. This is my only leverage. If I don't get my share, none of you are getting him back. The room fell silent, the weight of Chica's words hanging in the air. You think this is about money? Aunt Elizabeth said finally, her voice trembling with anger. You've dishonored your father, your family, for what? Greed? It's not just greed, Chike said quietly. It's justice. I deserve something, too. Kenneth took a step forward, his eyes blazing. You've gone too far, Chike. Whatever issues you had with Papa should have been resolved while he was alive. This is unforgivable. Chica's shoulders slumped, the defiance draining out of him. I just wanted to matter, he whispered. Agatha moved closer, tears in her eyes. You've always mattered, Chike. To Papa, to us. But this isn't the way. For the first time, Chike looked unsure. His gaze shifted to the shrouded body, then back to his siblings. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he said, his voice breaking. It has gone too far, Aunt Elizabeth said firmly. But it's not too late to make it right. Chike stared at them for a long moment before nodding slowly. Take him back. The family gathered around the shrouded figure, the weight of their grief mingling with the pain of betrayal. As they prepared to return their father's body to its rightful place, one thing was clear: the wounds Chike had inflicted would take far longer to heal than any of them had anticipated. As Kenneth bent to lift their father's body, Chica's voice thundered through the old family house. Stop! Everyone froze, their gazes snapping to him. Chica's face was twisted with raw emotion, his hands trembling as he pointed a finger at them. You're not taking him anywhere. He barked. Chike, what are you doing? Agatha asked, her voice trembling. What I should have done a long time ago, he snapped, stepping closer. You think this is over? You think you can just come here, guilt-trip me, and take him back like nothing happened? No. Chike, Kenneth said, his tone measured but firm. We're trying to make this right. Don't make it worse. Worse? Chike let out a bitter laugh. You have no idea what worse even looks like, Kenneth. You've lived your whole life as the golden child, the perfect son. Do you know what it's like to be treated like a shadow? Like a stain on this family's perfect picture? What are you talking about? Agatha demanded, tears welling in her eyes. You don't know? Chaik spat, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Of course, you don't. Why would you? You were too busy being daddy's little princess while I was being reminded every single day that I wasn't good enough. That's not fair, Agatha protested. Papa. Don't. Chaik cut her off, his voice shaking with rage. Don't you dare defend him. Do you know what it's like to be introduced as the other son? To walk into a room and feel the weight of everyone's judgment because I was the product of a mistake? The room fell silent. The words hung heavy in the air, each one a dagger to the heart. Chaik. Aunt Elizabeth began, but he silenced her with a glare. Don't, he warned. Don't try to make excuses. I'm done listening to excuses. He began pacing, his movements erratic as he unleashed years of pent-up frustration. I was 7 when I first realized I didn't belong. 7. Do you remember what happened that year, Agatha? Kenneth? They exchanged uneasy glances, unable to recall. Of course, you don't, Chaik said bitterly. It was the year Papa threw me out of the house. What? Agatha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Oh, you didn't know? Well, let me enlighten you. I broke one of his precious trophies while playing, and he lost it. He said I was a disgrace, that I was too much like my mother, wild, reckless, and unworthy. He dragged me by the arm and left me at Aunt Beatrice's house for 2 weeks without a word. Do you know what that does to a child? Agatha's tears fell freely now. Chaik, I didn't know. Of course, you didn't. He shouted. Because while I was being punished for existing, you were being showered with love and praise. Every report card I brought home wasn't good enough. Every achievement I had wasn't worth celebrating. And why? Because I was the mistress' son. Kenneth frowned. That's not true, Chaik. Papa never said that. Chaik rounded on him, his eyes blazing. Not in words, no. But actions speak louder, don't they? Why do you think you refused to put me in the family business? Why do you think I had to scrape and struggle for everything while you had everything handed to you? Chaik, Aunt Elizabeth began cautiously, your father had his flaws, but he loved you. Loved me? Chaik repeated, his voice cracking. He tolerated me. There's a difference. The room fell silent again, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. You want to know why I took his body? Chaik continued, his voice quieter but no less intense. Because it's the only way anyone in this family will ever listen to me. I've been screaming my whole life, but no one ever heard me. Maybe now you'll finally understand what it feels like to be ignored, to be treated like you don't matter. Agatha stepped forward cautiously, her hands outstretched. Chaik, we hear you now. And we're sorry. I'm sorry. If I had known. But you didn't, Chaik interrupted, his voice softening for the first time. And that's the point. No one cared enough to know. Chaik, Kenneth said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I can't change the past. None of us can. But this, what you're doing, it's not the way to heal. Let us take him back. Let's lay him to rest properly, together. Chaik stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as though he might relent. But then he shook his head. No, he said firmly. Not until I get what I deserve. My share of the wealth, my place in this family. Until then, he stays with me. Agatha's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, sobbing. Chaik, please, don't do this. He looked at her, his eyes filled with pain and resolve. I'm not doing this to hurt you, Agatha. I'm doing this because it's the only way he'll ever matter. If I have to hold on to his body to make that happen, so be it. As Chaik turned away, the room was filled with the sound of Agatha's sobs and Kenneth's heavy breathing. The family had come to retrieve their father, but they left with a deeper understanding of the wounds they had inflicted, and the knowledge that the battle for reconciliation was far from over. The silence in the room was deafening after Chika's outburst. His words had carved deep wounds into the family's hearts, leaving them grappling with guilt and shame. Agatha sat in the corner, her face buried in her hands, while Kenneth stood by the window, staring blankly at the street below. Aunt Elizabeth leaned against the wall, her arms crossed, deep in thought. Finally, Agatha broke the silence. I can't believe he's been carrying all that pain alone. Aunt Elizabeth sighed. He shouldn't have had to. We failed him, all of us. And your father. God rest his soul. He failed him most of all. Kenneth turned from the window, his expression hard. You're saying this now, but where were you when it mattered? Where were any of us? Agatha looked up, her eyes red and swollen. Do you think I didn't notice the way Papa treated Chaik? I did, Kenneth. But what could I have done? He was our father. You could have spoken up, Kenneth shot back. We all could have. You think it was that simple? Aunt Elizabeth interjected. Your father was a complicated man. He had his rules, his pride. He couldn't stand being reminded of his mistakes, and Chaik was a walking reminder of one. But he was still his son, Kenneth argued. He didn't deserve to be treated like an outsider in his own home. Agatha nodded slowly, her mind drifting back to moments she had long buried. I remember when Chaik was 8. Papa had promised to take all of us to the amusement park. Chaik was so excited, he kept talking about the roller coaster and the cotton candy. But when the day came, she trailed off, her voice breaking. Kenneth finished the story for her. Papa left without him. Agatha nodded, tears streaming down her face. Chaik waited by the door all day, clutching his little backpack. When Papa came home and Chaik asked him why he was left behind, do you remember what he said?
Kenneth's jaw tightened. He said, "You don't belong with us." Aunt Elizabeth closed her eyes, shaking her head. "I begged your father to take him, but he wouldn't listen. He said it was a family outing, and Chaik wasn't part of the family. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't push hard enough." "That wasn't the only time," Kenneth said bitterly. "Remember Chika's 12th birthday? He begged Papa for a bicycle. He even saved up his pocket money to contribute. But instead of buying him the bike, Papa bought me a new one, just because mine had a scratch." Agatha's voice trembled as she spoke. "And do you remember how Chaik tried to act like it didn't bother him? He smiled and said he didn't really want the bike anyway. But later that night, I heard him crying in his room." Kenneth ran a hand through his hair, his frustration boiling over. "And we just let it happen. Over and over again we let it happen. Every time Papa belittled him, every time he was excluded or overlooked, we stayed silent." Agatha looked down at her hands, guilt etched into every line of her face. "I was too scared to stand up to Papa. I thought it wasn't my place." "But it was," Kenneth said firmly. "It was all of our place. We were his family and we failed him." Aunt Elizabeth's voice was soft but steady. "Do you know the last thing your father said to me before he passed? He said he regretted not doing right by Chaik. He said he wished he could go back and fix it, but he didn't know how." "That's not good enough," Kenneth said, his voice laced with anger. "Regret doesn't erase the years of pain Chaik endured. It doesn't erase the way we made him feel like he was nothing." Agatha wiped her tears and stood up. "So what do we do now? How do we fix this?" "We start by acknowledging the truth," Aunt Elizabeth said. "We face what we've done, and we tell Chaik we're sorry, not just with words, but with actions. He deserves to know that he matters." Kenneth nodded. "And we make sure he gets his share of the inheritance. It's the least we can do." Agatha hesitated. "But do you think it will be enough? After everything he's been through?" "It's a start," Aunt Elizabeth said. "We can't change the past, but we can try to make amends. It's up to Chaik whether he forgives us or not. But we owe it to him to try." The three of them stood in silence, the weight of their memories and guilt pressing down on them. For years, they had turned a blind eye to Chika's pain, but now they were ready to face it head-on. As they prepared to confront him, they knew the road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time, they were united in their determination to make things right, for Chaik, for their family, and for the man who had unknowingly left a legacy of pain and division behind. The room was dim, illuminated only by the flickering light of a single candle on the table. Chaik sat in silence, his father's lifeless body wrapped in a pristine white cloth lying before him. The sight should have brought peace or closure, but instead, it brought a flood of memories that made his chest ache. He traced the edges of the cloth with trembling fingers, his mind drifting back to a day he had tried so hard to forget. It was raining heavily that afternoon, and the sound of thunder had echoed through the streets as he stood shivering at the front door of the family home. He had been just 7 years old, his tiny suitcase clutched in his hands, and his mother standing beside him. "You'll be better off here, Chaik," she had said, her voice trembling but firm. "Mama, please don't leave me," he had begged, tears streaming down his face. His mother had knelt down, her hands on his shoulders. "I have no choice, my son. Your father will take care of you now. This is where you belong." She had kissed his forehead and knocked on the door before quickly walking away, leaving him standing in the rain. The door creaked open, and his father appeared, his expression cold and unwelcoming. "What is this?" his father had asked, his gaze flicking from Chaik to the retreating figure of his mother. "It's me, Papa. Mama said I should stay here with you," Chaik had said, his voice trembling. His father had frowned, his lips curling in disdain. "Bring your bag and come in." The memory made Chike's throat tighten. He could still feel the weight of the rejection in his father's tone, the chill of the rain soaking through his clothes. "Why did you leave me with him, Mama?" He whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking. He closed his eyes, and more memories surfaced. Memories of days when he was made to sit in the corner of the dining room while his siblings ate lavish meals. "Chike, why are you not eating?" His younger half-brother had asked one evening. "Because he's being punished," their father had answered sharply, not even sparing Chike a glance. "For what?" his sister had pressed. "For existing," Chike had muttered under his breath, earning him a sharp glare from their father. "Don't speak unless spoken to," his father had snapped, slamming his fork onto his plate. Chike's stomach growled at the memory of the hunger he had endured. He was never starved outright, but the portions he was given were always smaller, the meals less satisfying than what his siblings enjoyed. It was as if his father wanted to remind him constantly that he was different, that he didn't belong. The white cloth covering his father's body seemed almost mocking now, pristine and unblemished, a stark contrast to the man it covered. Chike's hands clenched into fists. "You had everything, Papa. You could have given me so much, but all you gave me was pain." His thoughts drifted to his schooling. While Kenneth and Agatha had attended the best private schools, Chike was sent to a rundown government school. He remembered the first day he realized the gap between them. "Your uniform is old," one of the other boys had sneered at him during recess. Chike had looked down at his patched shirt and frayed shorts, his cheeks burning with shame. "My papa said government schools are for poor people," another boy had added, laughing. Chike had clenched his fists but said nothing, knowing there was no one to defend him. He couldn't even blame the boys. They were simply echoing the words of their parents, words that reflected how his father truly felt about him. "Why, Papa?" he whispered again, his voice barely audible. "Why did you hate me so much?" The door creaked open behind him, pulling him from his thoughts. Aunt Elizabeth stepped in cautiously, her face etched with concern. "Chike, you've been sitting here for hours," she said gently. "You should rest." He didn't turn to look at her. "Do you know what he used to call me?" Elizabeth paused. "What?" "The charity case," Chike said bitterly. "Whenever he introduced me to someone, he'd say, 'This is Chike, my son from another arrangement,' as if I was some mistake he regretted but couldn't erase." Elizabeth sighed and sat beside him. "Your father. He wasn't perfect, Chike. He had his flaws, and he made many mistakes. But I truly believe he loved you in his own way." Chike finally turned to face her, his eyes filled with anger and hurt. "Do you call that love? Neglecting me? Making me feel like a burden? Do you know how many nights I cried myself to sleep because I wanted just one kind word from him?" Elizabeth reached out to touch his hand, but he pulled away. "Do you know what hurts the most?" he continued, his voice trembling. "It's not even the things he did. It's the things he didn't do. He never hugged me. He never told me he was proud of me. He never looked at me like I mattered." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "Chike, I'm so sorry. I should have done more. We all should have." "It's too late for sorry," Chike said quietly. "He's gone now, and nothing any of you say can change what he put me through." Elizabeth nodded, her tears falling freely. "You're right. We can't change the past. But Chike, holding on to this anger will only hurt you more. Let it go. Not for him, but for yourself." Chike looked back at his father's body, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. He wanted to hate the man lying there, but a small part of him, a part he had buried deep, still yearned for the father he never had. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Elizabeth placed a hand on his shoulder. "Take your time, Chike. But know this, you are not a mistake. You never were." As she left the room, Chike sat in silence, staring at the white cloth. The memories continued to haunt him, but for the first time, he allowed himself to grieve, not just for the father he had lost, but for the childhood he had been denied. The tension in the living room was palpable as Chike stood by the window, staring at the rustling leaves outside. Behind him, his half-siblings and their mother sat in uneasy silence, the weight of their collective guilt pressing down on them. For the first time in years, the family was united, not in celebration but in reckoning. Aunt Elizabeth cleared her throat and broke the silence. "Chike, we've all talked. We know we've wronged you in more ways than we can count. What your father did, what we allowed to happen, it was unacceptable. Chike turned slowly, his expression unreadable. And Kenneth, his eldest half-brother, stepped forward, holding an envelope in his hands. His voice was shaky as he spoke. We've decided to give you what you asked for, your rightful share of the inheritance. It's not much compared to what we kept, but it's yours. Chike stared at the envelope, his jaw tightening. This isn't about the money, Kenneth. It was never about the money. This was about respect, about acknowledgement, about being treated like I mattered. Agatha, his half-sister, sniffled and wiped her tears. We know that now. We were blind, Chike. Papa, he taught us to look down on you, but that doesn't excuse our behavior. We're sorry. Chike's gaze softened slightly, though he didn't move to take the envelope. Do you even understand what it was like for me? To grow up in a house where every glance, every word reminded me I didn't belong? To be punished for something I had no control over? Being born to the wrong mother? Kenneth stepped closer, holding the envelope out again. We can't undo the past, Chike, but we can try to make things right. Please, take this. After a long pause, Chike finally reached out and took the envelope. He didn't open it. He simply stared at it for a moment before slipping it into his pocket. You'll get the body, he said quietly. It's in the mortuary where it should have been all along. The family exhaled collectively, the relief evident on their faces. Thank you, Chike, Agatha said softly. We'll arrange the burial, and we hope you'll come. Chike shook his head. I've done my part. The rest is up to you. I won't be there. Chike, please, Elizabeth interjected, her voice pleading. This is your father's burial. It's your family's closure. Chike's lips curled into a bitter smile. Closure? I've been closing chapters of my life without any of you for years. This one is no different. He turned to leave, but then stopped at the door. Without turning around, he said, I don't hate you all. I don't even hate him anymore. But I can't stay here. Not in this house. Not in this city. Kenneth stepped forward. Where will you go? Somewhere new, Chike replied. Somewhere I can start over without the weight of this family dragging me down. As he walked out, his siblings watched him in silence, their guilt heavy but their respect for him newfound. The next morning, Chike boarded a bus heading out of the city. He sat by the window, his bag at his feet, and stared at the passing landscape. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of freedom. He pulled out the envelope Kenneth had given him and opened it. Inside was a check and a handwritten note. We hope this helps you find the peace and happiness you deserve. We're sorry for everything. Your family. Chike folded the note and placed it back in the envelope, then closed his eyes and leaned back in his seat. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. The bus rolled on, leaving behind the city of his pain and taking him toward a fresh start. Chike wasn't sure where he would end up, but he knew one thing for certain. He was finally free.